Mince pies are supposed to be the safest Christmas treat, something most of us buy without even checking the label. But after looking into independent tests, ingredient lists, and consumer reviews, one thing became clear very quickly. Not all mince pies are made equal, and some popular UK brands are cutting corners you'd never expect. From overly processed fillings to misleading premium marketing, certain mince pies are riding on tradition while quietly lowering quality. In this video, I'm counting down 8 UK mince pie brands you should avoid. Then I'll show you 3 mince pie brands that actually deserve your money. And finally, I'll teach you how to spot the red flags yourself, so festive packaging never fools you again. Bad brand 8. Waitrose all butter mince pies. Waitrose has a reputation that does a lot of the work for it. When people see a Waitrose mince pie, they assume higher standards, better ingredients, and something closer to homemade than factory made. It's the kind of product shoppers buy specifically to avoid the problems they associate with cheaper supermarket options. You expect balance, proper spicing, and restraint, especially at this price point. But once you look at independent taste tests and consumer feedback, that confidence starts to weaken. These pies are repeatedly criticized for being overly sweet, with a filling that tastes more like jam than a rich mix of dried fruit and spice. The spice profile, which should be the heart of a good mince pie, is often described as faint or missing altogether. The pastry raises similar concerns. Despite being labelled all butter, many reviewers found it bland and underwhelming, lacking the depth and richness you'd expect from a premium product. That creates an uncomfortable question. If a brand known for quality delivers something this flat, how much of what you're paying for is the product? And how much is the name? What makes this frustrating isn't that the pie is inedible, it's that it leans heavily on trust and tradition while delivering something closer to mass-produced sameness. When well-known brands lower the bar without consequences, shoppers stop questioning, and festive food quietly becomes just another processed purchase. For families who deliberately choose Waitrose to avoid this exact kind of disappointment, that gap between expectation and reality feels like a letdown. And this is only the beginning of the list. The next brand shows how cutting corners isn't limited to so-called premium retailers. Bad brand 7. Greggs Merry Little Moments, mince pies. Greggs isn't a brand people associate with luxury, but it is a brand people trust for value and familiarity. These mince pies feel like a safe, no-nonsense choice, something you grab alongside a coffee or pick up knowing exactly what you're getting. They're cheap, accessible, and widely liked, which makes people far less likely to question them. That confidence starts to crack when you look at how these pies actually perform. Independent taste panels and consumer reviews regularly point to the same issue. The filling lacks depth. Instead of a layered mix of dried fruit, spice, and warmth, the flavor often comes across as flat and one note. Several reviewers noted that the fruit taste is there, but the spices you expect from a mince pie barely register. The pastry doesn't do much to rescue it. Many found it dry or underwhelming, offering little richness or contrast to the sweet filling. The result is a mince pie that technically ticks the boxes but never really delivers the festive experience it promises. The problem here isn't shock, it's normalization. When products like this become a seasonal habit, expectations quietly drop. A mince pie becomes something you eat out of routine, not something you enjoy. And when a brand built on convenience delivers something forgettable year after year, it reinforces the idea that this is just how mince pies are. That mindset is exactly what allows standards across the board to slide. When shoppers accept blandness as normal, there's no incentive to do better. And as the list goes on, you'll see how that quiet acceptance creates much bigger problems with brands that should know better. Bad brand 6. Lidl Deluxe all butter mince pies. At first glance, these look like a smart buy. The word Deluxe does a lot of heavy lifting, and Lidl has built a reputation for offering premium-looking products at lower prices. For many shoppers, this feels like the best of both worlds. Festive presentation, all butter on the label, and a price that makes stocking up easy. But once people actually taste them, the cracks start to show. A common complaint is that the pastry overwhelms everything else. Instead of being light and buttery, it's often described as thick and dominant. pulling attention away from the filling rather than supporting it. When pastry becomes the main event in a mince pie, something has already gone wrong. The filling doesn't help much either. Reviewers regularly describe it as overly sweet and jam-like, with very little spice or depth coming through. The warmth you expect from a mince pie, that mix of citrus, dried fruit, and subtle alcohol notes, is largely missing. What you're left with is sweetness without complexity. This is where the Deluxe label becomes questionable. The branding suggests indulgence and care, but the experience feels closer to cost-controlled production dressed up in festive language. It's not that the pie is offensive, it's that it doesn't live up to what it promises. And that gap between promise and delivery matters. When brands rely on seasonal buzzwords instead of flavor and balance, shoppers end up paying for presentation rather than quality. It's another example of how easily expectations can be managed downward without most people realizing. As we move further down the list, that gap only gets wider, and the next brand shows how even familiar supermarket staples can quietly miss the mark in bigger ways. Bad Brand 5. Asda Joyous Mince Pies. These are the kind of mince pies many households buy without a second thought. They're affordable, widely available, and clearly aimed at families stocking up for the season. The branding feels cheerful and reliable, and for a lot of shoppers, that's enough, especially when you're buying multiple boxes for guests or kids. But once you look past the packaging, the experience doesn't quite hold up. A frequent criticism is how manufactured these pies feel. The filling is often described as overly smooth and jam-like, lacking the chunky dried fruit texture that gives a mince pie its character. Instead of tasting layered and festive, it comes across as flat and sugary. The flavor profile raises similar concerns. Spice, the thing that should make a mince pie feel warm and seasonal, is barely noticeable. Several reviews point out that the sweetness overwhelms everything else, making each bite feel heavy rather than comforting. It's the kind of sweetness that feels engineered, not balanced. Visually, the pies also give away their mass-produced nature. They tend to look uniform and plain, reinforcing the sense that this is a product designed for speed and scale rather than care. That's not surprising at this price point, but it becomes an issue when expectations are set higher than what's delivered. The bigger problem is how easily this becomes the default. When products like this dominate supermarket shelves, they quietly redefine what people think a mince pie should taste like. And once that happens, it becomes harder to recognize when quality has slipped, especially as we get closer to the brands that are trusted the most. Bad Brand 4. Iceland. 6. Mince pies. Iceland is a brand many shoppers associate with convenience and reliability. These mince pies are often bought as part of a bigger festive shop. Easy to grab, easy to store, and cheap enough that people don't feel the need to scrutinize them. For a lot of households, they're a backup option that quietly becomes the main one. But once people actually pay attention to how they taste, the same criticism keeps coming up. The filling is frequently described as overly smooth and jam-like, almost pureed with very little texture from dried fruit. Instead of feeling rich and traditional, it comes across as simplified and stripped down. That lack of texture is matched by a lack of complexity. Reviewers often note that there's very little spice, no warmth, and no real depth of flavor. The sweetness dominates everything, making the pie feel heavy rather than festive. The pastry doesn't help much either, often described as bland and forgettable, there to hold the filling rather than add anything of its own. What makes this more disappointing is how familiar this experience has become. When the same shortcuts show up year after year, they stop standing out as flaws and start feeling normal. And that's how expectations quietly drop across the board. Quick pause here. If this is already changing how you think about mince pies, it's worth liking the video and subscribing. The worst brands on this list are still coming, and they're far more widely bought than most people realize. Because from this point on, the issues aren't just about blandness. The next brand shows how festive twists and novelty flavors can actually hide some of the biggest quality problems of all. Bad Brand 3. Morrisons, the best all-butter mince pies. Morrisons. The best range is meant to signal a step up. Better ingredients, more care, and something closer to a traditional mince pie done properly. It's the option shoppers choose when they want reassurance without paying specialist prices. On paper, this should be a solid middle to upper tier contender. But when you look at consumer feedback and supermarket taste comparisons, these mince pies tend to underperform relative to their positioning. A common criticism is imbalance. The filling is often described as overly sweet and lacking depth, with the dried fruit blending into a smooth, jam-like consistency rather than offering texture. The spice profile, which should give warmth and character, is frequently described as muted or indistinct. The pastry doesn't fully deliver either. Despite the all butter label, many reviewers find it bland and slightly heavy, adding structure but little richness. Instead of enhancing the filling, it fades into the background, leaving the overall pie feeling flat rather than festive. What places this brand on the avoid list isn't that it's awful, it's that it doesn't justify the trust placed in it. When a product positioned as the best delivers something that feels safe but forgettable, it reinforces the exact problem this list highlights: expectations quietly being lowered. For shoppers reaching for this range to avoid disappointment, the result is often a mince pie that's acceptable but rarely memorable, and at this level, acceptable simply isn't good enough. Bad brand 2, Tesco 6. Merry mince pies, these are everywhere, picked up last minute, thrown into trolleys without thought. Tesco's standard mince pies are one of the most common choices in the UK, especially during a rushed Christmas shop. They're familiar, affordable, and feel like a safe default. The kind of product people assume is good enough because it's been around forever. That's exactly why they're so rarely questioned. Once you start looking at reviews and taste test feedback, a clear pattern appears. The filling is often described as overly sweet and oddly one-dimensional, with very little of the rich, spiced fruit flavor people expect. Instead of tasting layered or warming, it comes across as sugary and flat, closer to jam than mincemeat. The pastry doesn't help. Many tasters noted that it lacks flavor beyond sweetness, with very little buttery depth or texture. Rather than framing the filling, it fades into the background, making the whole pie feel hollow and forgettable. When both the pastry and filling underperform, there's nothing left to carry the experience. What pushes this brand so high on the list is how normalized this has become. When a product this widely bought delivers such a stripped-down version of a mince pie, it quietly resets expectations for millions of people. Blandness becomes acceptable. Sweetness replaces spice. Tradition turns into habit rather than quality, and that's the real issue. When one of the UK's biggest retailers sells a mince pie that relies on familiarity instead of flavour, it encourages complacency, both from shoppers and from the brand itself. Which brings us to number 1, because if this feels disappointing, the final brand on this list goes even further, combining mass appeal, festive trust, and the biggest gap between expectation and reality of them all. Bad brand 1, Lidl Deluxe, Speculoos, almond mince pies. This is the mince pie that surprises people the most because on the surface it looks like the safest festive upgrade you can make. The packaging feels premium, the flavour sounds indulgent, and the Deluxe label suggests this is Lidl at its best, not its cheapest. For a lot of shoppers, this feels like the smart choice. But once you look at how this pie is actually received, it becomes clear why it lands at number 1. Independent taste tests and consumer reviews were unusually blunt. Instead of being described as festive or indulgent, the dominant reaction was rejection. The Speculoos flavour doesn't complement the mince, it overwhelms it. The almond note adds heaviness rather than balance. What should feel layered ends up tasting muddled and excessive. Texture makes the problem worse. The filling is often described as thick, dense and paste-like, with very little contrast or fruit definition. Rather than feeling like a mince pie with a creative twist, it feels like a novelty product that forgot the basics. When sweetness, spice, and richness are all pushed to extremes, the result stops feeling festive and starts feeling artificial. What makes this particularly frustrating is how misleading the presentation is. This pie looks like an upgrade, but for many tasters, it was the lowest scoring product in its category. Strong flavours are doing the work that balance and care should have done instead, and that's why this sits number 1. Not because it's unsafe, but because it represents the biggest disconnect between branding and reality. A product sold as premium, festive, and indulgent that left many people unwilling to finish it. Now that you've seen which mince pies are worth avoiding, it's time to flip the script, because there are brands still doing this properly. Up next are 3 mince pie brands that actually deserve your money. Recommended brand 3, Waitrose Golden Limoncello Mince Pies. After everything you've seen so far, this is where the tone finally starts to change. These mince pies are a reminder that when brands actually try to do something thoughtfully, it shows. From the moment people taste them, the feedback is noticeably different. Not just fine, but genuinely positive. What stands out first is balance. The limoncello flavour is clear, but it doesn't overwhelm the mince filling. Instead of masking the fruit and spice, it lifts it. Reviewers consistently describe the citrus note as bright and controlled, adding freshness rather than sweetness. That alone sets these apart from many novelty mince pies that rely on shock value instead of harmony. The filling also feels more intentional. There's texture from the dried fruit, and the flavour doesn't collapse into a single sugary note. You still get warmth and spice, but without the heaviness that plagues so many mass-market options. It feels closer to something made with an actual recipe, not just a formula. The pastry plays its part too. While not perfect, it's widely regarded as more buttery and supportive than many competitors, framing the filling rather than disappearing behind it. That might sound like a small detail, but at this point in the list, it's a noticeable upgrade. This isn't being recommended because it's trendy or different. It's being recommended because it shows restraint. It proves that a flavoured mince pie doesn't have to abandon tradition to work. And while it's not the best overall option you can buy, it earns its place here by actually respecting the basics. The next recommendation goes a step further, stripping things back even more and showing why sometimes the simplest mince pies are the hardest to get right. Recommended brand 2, M&S Classic All Butter Mince Pies. This is where things start to feel reassuring again. Marks & Spencer has built its reputation on consistency, and with these mince pies, that consistency actually shows up where it matters. Instead of relying on gimmicks or novelty, this is a straightforward, traditional mince pie done properly. The biggest difference people notice is depth of flavour. The filling tastes layered rather than sugary, with dried fruit that still has texture and spice that actually comes through. It doesn't feel rushed or flattened, which is a common problem with cheaper, mass-produced options. The sweetness is controlled, allowing the spice and fruit to do the work instead of being drowned out. The pastry also earns its keep. Reviewers regularly describe it as richer and more buttery than most supermarket rivals, with a structure that supports the filling instead of overpowering it. It's not flashy, but it feels deliberate, like something that was tested, adjusted, and refined rather than rushed to shelf. What makes this a recommendation rather than just acceptable is reliability. People who buy these year after year know exactly what they're getting. That predictability is rare in a category where recipes quietly change and standards often slip without notice. This isn't the cheapest option, and it isn't pretending to be. But for shoppers who want a classic mince pie that actually tastes like one, it stands out as a solid choice. And finally, there's one brand that consistently beats the rest, not through hype or heritage, but by simply getting the fundamentals right. Recommended brand 1. Aldi specially selected all butter mince pies. This is the point where expectations usually flip. People don't expect the best mince pie on the shelf to come from Aldi, and that's exactly why these stand out so clearly. Time after time, independent taste tests and consumer reviews put these at or near the top. And once you look at why, it makes sense. The first thing people notice is balance. The filling tastes properly fruity, not jam-like, with a mix of dried fruit that still has texture. The spice is present without being aggressive, and the sweetness is controlled rather than dominant. Nothing shouts, nothing overwhelms, it just works. The pastry is another big reason these win so consistently. It's described as genuinely buttery, well-cooked and supportive rather than thick or bland. Instead of feeling like a wrapper, it actually adds to the experience. That alone puts it ahead of many so-called premium rivals. What really sets these apart is intent. They don't rely on novelty flavors or heavy branding to sell themselves. They rely on getting the fundamentals right: flavor, texture, and restraint. And that's why so many testers say the same thing. They'd buy them again. For a category full of shortcuts, this is proof that price doesn't have to mean compromise. Sometimes the best product is simply the one that respects the recipe. And now that you know which brands to avoid and which ones are worth buying, the final question is this: how do you spot the bad ones for yourself? How to spot mince pie brands you should avoid. Once you know what to look for, the patterns become obvious. Start with the ingredient list. If the filling reads like a syrup, heavy on sugar, vague fruit descriptions and very little spice, that's usually a warning sign. Good mince pies don't need to hide behind excessive sweetness. Next, be cautious of buzzwords. Deluxe, luxury, and festive twist don't guarantee quality. In many cases, they're used to distract from imbalance or over-processing. Strong flavors often cover weak foundations. Texture matters too. Reviews that mention jammy, paste-like, or one-note fillings are describing shortcuts, not tradition. A proper mince pie should have contrast: fruit, spice, and pastry all doing their job. Finally, trust patterns, not hype. When multiple reviews point to the same flaws year after year, that's not bad luck, it's how the product is designed. The good news is this: once you start noticing these signs, you don't need a list anymore. You'll be able to spot which mince pies are worth your money and which ones are just riding on Christmas nostalgia. And if this helped, share it with someone who does the festive shop in your household. Chances are it'll save them from buying the wrong box. If you found this useful, share it with whoever does the Christmas food shop in your house. It might save them from buying the wrong box and starting an argument at the dessert table. And if you want more breakdowns like this, honest, researched, and straight to the point, subscribe. Because the more people who start questioning what's on the shelf, the harder it becomes for brands to hide behind tradition. Christmas food should be comforting, not disappointing. And now you know how to tell the difference.